I'm Hazem Sika. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, Egypt pays the price for Russia's ban on wheat exports. As other commodity prices soar, we ask what part speculators are playing. Floods forced Pakistan's biggest refinery to shut down, bringing parts of the country to a standstill. In an election year, the Fed steps in to help the economy as Obama hands struggling states $26 billion. Welcome to the program. Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon and Jordan are scrambling to fill a huge void left by Russia's ban on wheat exports. Russia is struggling with its worst drought in 130 years. Its neighbor Ukraine is also considering introducing export quotas. Together, the nations represent 21% of global wheat trade, and that could push food prices higher. In 2008, record crop prices led to food riots from Haiti to Egypt. And that's where we're going to start, in Egypt. Hefty state subsidies keep bread affordable, where a fifth of the population lives on less than $1 a day. Egypt estimates its subsidy bill will rise to $700 million from $400 million. And in this holy month of Ramadan, Egyptians increase their consumption of bread, and that has sent prices soaring. Ayman Mohyeddin reports.
It's a daily routine for Egypt's bakeries. With a population of more than 80 million, the demand for daily bread is high. It has made Egypt the world's largest importer of wheat. Each year, Egypt imports nearly 8 to 9 million tons of wheat. Nearly 60% of that comes from Russia alone. In the wake of a ban by the Russian government on wheat exports, Egypt will have to import an additional 60,000 tons a month to make up for the shortfall. It could lead to a diplomatic fallout. The Egyptian Minister of Trade summoned a Russian envoy in Cairo to express concern over the non-delivery of 500,000 tons of Russian wheat ordered before the ban on exports was announced. While the government insists that the cost of the Russian wheat crisis won't be passed on to Egyptian consumers, people on the streets of Egypt aren't convinced.
Of course it's a problem for us. We import our wheat from Russia, so if there's a drought, then we will be affected.
Prices will rise. There won't be any exports. Russia's crops have been burned. They're ruined.
Rather than boost its own domestic wheat production, the Egyptian government continues to subsidize foreign imports for domestic consumption, making it much more vulnerable to global prices and supply fluctuations. But for now, the cost of importing wheat may be less expensive than trying to change Egypt's welfare state.
Well, wheat prices were soaring well before Russia's decision to ban exports. Samah Al-Shahat is in our London Broadcast Centre with more.
Thanks. Incessant high temperatures and forest fires have scorched massive areas of arable land in Russia, sparking fears of price hikes and food shortages. Russia believes its grain harvest will dive 38% to 60 million metric tons this year. The next 5 weeks are crucial for Russia. It will know if it gets enough rain to grow winter crops. Niamh Barker has more.
The Kremlin is reduced to a hazy outline as thick smog blankets the capital for a second week. Wildfires raging across several Russian regions are proving difficult to control. The heat wave has ravaged farmland and destroyed crops over an area the size of Portugal, leaving farming communities in dire straits. Russia is the world's third largest exporter of grain, but the driest summer since records began has cut production by 20%. The crisis has prompted Prime Minister Vladimir Putin to ban wheat exports until December to protect Russia against price hikes and shortages.
Due to abnormally high temperatures and drought, I believe it's reasonable to introduce a temporary ban on grain and wheat products export from the territory of the Russian Federation. We need to prevent a rise in domestic food prices. We need to preserve the number of cattle and build up reserves for next year. As the saying goes, reserves don't make your pocket heavy.
From the point of view of food security, the decision was absolutely right. We cannot afford to risk exporting our grain when the country faces such a terrible drought.
If the temperatures continue, these prices are going to go very much the same way as the soaring temperatures, affecting the cost of not only things like bread and pasta, but also other basic foodstuffs like milk and meat. Commodity traders have reacted to the fires and drought by pushing up the price of wheat to a 23-month high, triggering gloomy forecasts that bread prices across Europe may have to rise. The heatwave, drought and wildfires are estimated to have cost the Russian economy $15 billion, a figure that's steadily rising.
Well, joining me now is Gary Dunyan from the World Development Movement and Dennis Drexler from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Rome to discuss whether banking speculation is forcing the price of food commodities such as cocoa and wheat to rise. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me. Gary, let me start with you. Do you think we are at the early stages of a food price crisis, a global food price crisis?
That's certainly possible. What we're seeing now is not dissimilar to what we saw in the most recent food price crisis between 2006 and 2008, which is that you had a genuine rise in the fundamental price of food commodities. In that case, we had poor wheat harvests, particularly in developing countries. In this case, we've got a very poor wheat harvest and fires and so on in Russia. And what tends to happen then is that speculators will latch onto that and drive the price higher. Now, we've had price warnings.
Let me just jump in there. When you say speculators are pushing the prices to rise, how do they do that?
They do that by essentially gambling that the price will continue to rise. That sends a strong market signal that it will, and that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by speculators, I mean people who are trading in derivatives on the price of food. So that's a paper contract which is based on the future price of food.
Dennis, do you think that food should be speculated against in this way? Should it be traded like this?
Well, if you present speculation the way as it was just done, possibly not. But we need to understand that speculation fulfills multiple functions and also very fundamental functions for the actual producers of agricultural goods, who oftentimes look for ways to protect against the risks that they're facing in the production cycle. And by selling futures, commodity futures, for example, they can find a way to protect against these risks. So speculation also fulfills very important functions.
Okay, then let me ask you a question. Do you think that food speculation could ever cause food prices to decrease?
Well, certainly there might be an effect, although we should be very careful in jumping to any conclusions here. The evidence that you find, the analysis that have been conducted are very inconclusive. You find some that say, yes, clearly there has been an effect, also driving up prices, and maybe they have caused the food price crisis that we witnessed about 2 years ago. But you also find lots of studies that claim exactly the opposite. So certainly we need to have much more information. We need to have more knowledge, and more analysis needs to be undertaken in order to really answer this question definitely, and also come up with the right policy measures in order to prevent this, if indeed there is a correlation.
I mean, in many ways, Gary, I mean, that's a very good point that Dennis makes, because the research has been pretty inconclusive. I mean, the OECD just this month have come out saying that there might not actually be necessarily a relationship between food speculation or banking speculation and rise in food prices. But you disagree with that?
I do disagree with that. There are one or two studies that make that point, but I know that Dennis' organisation, the Food and Agriculture Organisation, studied this in 2009. Their conclusions were wide-ranging as to the causes of food prices, but they certainly felt that one of the reasons was speculation. We know that Merrill Lynch, who is of course a participant in this and is not a campaigner with an axe to grind, assessed that even at 2006, at the start of that spike, that speculation was causing food to trade at about 50% above what the fundamental price would have been.
But what do you say to what Dennis had said, that actually speculation can have beneficial effects?
Well, he's absolutely right, and speculation actually began, as he says, as a way for farmers to insure against locust infestations, bad weather, that kind of thing. And it began in the United States. And in the United States, through the teens and particularly 1920s, you had what began as a very sensible and effective model of risk reduction used as a gambling chip by Wall Street bankers. And that, of course, ultimately ended in the Wall Street crash. That kind of behaviour ended in the Wall Street crash. And that's when you got the regulations that are now being eroded again.
No, but it's an interesting point, Dennis, because we are beginning to see now in financial markets that excessive speculation is beginning to be curbed. But what I see that in food commodities, it's still very much so like the Wild West. Regulation hasn't really done very much there. It's still very much so an untouched market.
we need to know what is happening in these markets. What are the volumes that are traded? There need to be regulation that these things are disclosed, and then of course there need to be mechanisms in order to inform the public that oftentimes also, even if this information is available, chooses not to be informed and simply follow blindly a trend. So I think we need to work on these both fronts, on the availability of this information, but also then on finding the right mechanisms in order to inform the public. Now, I wanted to come back to something that was said earlier about the self-fulfilling prophecy that you might have when you look at speculation, because there's simply a trend and you confirm this trend by jumping the bandwagon. I think the same is happening now if we start talking about a potential food crisis and a repetition of what we've seen in 2007, 2008. Again, I think this is more destabilizing the market than bringing in, a sense of rationality and looking at the fundamentals. Because what we've seen is, yes, there might be a potential shortfall in Russia and in other important exporters of wheat in this case, but the stocks are still plenty, and we have no reason to believe that at this moment, we have to fear anything similar to a situation that we faced 3 years ago. So we should be a bit more careful in how we call these things.
Okay, but isn't, I suppose, part of the problem for food commodities is the fact that many investors in financial markets have decided to almost move their investment because of the financial crisis into food commodities, which they see as more safe?
That's exactly right. And for me, that's the main reason for the 2006-2008 spike. And it's obviously not something we're seeing right now, because it's not happening at the same time as the rest of the banking crisis we had at that time. At that time, investors were fleeing credit, so subprime mortgage packages, derivatives, and they were fleeing currency. And there were a lot of houses that were talking up commodities as a good, safe bet for that money. And that means that the way that commodities prices were responding, or commodities derivatives prices were responding, was based on, if you like, the market fundamentals of credit or of currency, not the market fundamentals of food. And that is why they have a very poor record in discovering, as they call it on the market, a fair price for food.
Okay, Dennis, last question to you. Speak to me a little bit more about why is it, in many ways, that investment in agriculture has been neglected?
Well, if I knew the reason, I would tell you right now, and,
I know, that's why it's the
and
last
we would all be
question.
happy. Certainly, the FAO would be very happy if we knew the answer.
But,
the only thing we can do is to...
Sorry, I beg your pardon. For a while, the World Bank and the IMF were very anti-agriculture.
Yes, it has been a neglected sector, and I think we've been successful, especially with last year's, with the spike in the number of undernourished people in the world, but also with the global summit that we had last year here in Rome. I think we have successfully opened the eyes to these actors, development actors, that agriculture is something that they need to consider in the development strategies, that agriculture can really be a key for the broader development of a country. And this does not just mean that we provide the means that they can feed their people, but it can mean that this will actually be the basis for real development of these countries. So I do think there's been a rethinking. You see this also in the trend of official development assistance, which has been down as low as 5% of all these funds went into agriculture. Now there's a slight upward trend. I don't know if we will see the 20% that we had about 20 years ago, but even a movement to 10-15% would already be a success, and the FAO, will continue to argue in this direction.
Dennis Drexler in Rome, thank you very much for joining me, and Gary Dunyan here in London, thank you also.
Thank you.
When Counting the Cost returns, the US Federal Reserve springs to the aid of the economy, plus Pakistan's floods cripple life and brings much of the country to a halt. Welcome to Counting the Cost, your weekly business and finance stop right here on Al Jazeera. The worst floods in Pakistan's history have displaced 14 million people. Many of their houses have been destroyed, food prices have rocketed, and they've fled to relief camps. An area the size of Lebanon has been submerged. Pakistan's halted the production at one gas field that accounts for about 10% of its gas output. Fuel shortages are being reported as the country's biggest oil refinery has also been closed because of the threat from floodwaters. Well, the refinery is in the town of Muzaffarnagar in Pakistan's Punjab province. From there, Kamal Haider sent this report.
crisis after crisis, as people seek refuge, leaving behind their villages and carrying few belongings. For many, the higher ground provides a brief respite from the ever-encroaching flood waters. But the heat is unrelenting, and families huddle together to find what shade they can. The old and the young are particularly vulnerable, and there is no clean drinking water. Further down this road, others find shelter among the sand dunes. In the background, smoke billows from a power station. Muzaffargarh has 3 electricity plants, but even before the floods, there were massive power shortages, and now the fast-moving waters has forced the closure of one of the country's largest oil refineries. Pakistan's humanitarian crisis may be getting worse with the shutdown of one of the country's largest oil refineries situated here in Muzaffargarh. We cannot go there because it is now surrounded by water. You can see hundreds of trucks lining up on the roadside. They would have been collecting fuel from that refinery, carrying it to other parts of the country where it is needed most. The shutdown of the refinery has already led to fuel shortages in the largest city of southern Punjab. In a desperate bid to buy fuel, motorcyclists are willing to pay more at this roadside facility, where dealers are taking advantage of shortages to make extra money.
You can see some people are already fleecing us. But do we have a choice? With the closure of the refinery, things can only get worse. It's all because of the flood.
The effects of the shortages was even more evident, with long queues at the filling stations and amidst fears of a potential fuel crisis, which could mean longer wait for those in need of desperate help.
Zimbabwe officially launched the sale of its Marange diamonds. That's after a global diamond trading watchdog endorsed the stones. Zimbabwe is rich in diamonds, but it's not clear if everyone will benefit. Haru Mutasa reports from Harare.
A decade of political and economic instability has left Zimbabwe's majority desperate to eke out a living, selling anything to put food on the table. Now their politicians tell them the country's diamond deposits could be the answer. The Kimberley Process, the global watchdog that monitors diamond trading, says Zimbabwe's diamonds are conflict-free. And on Wednesday, Zimbabwe sold 900,000 carats, worth around $72 million. The poor hope the money generated from the sale will be spent wisely.
Thousands of people, they have no jobs. So if the government can do something with the money to open the industry, we want the industries, that's the big thing, to be opened.
You also have to renovate roads, houses, some like, you see these flats, all of them, they are being blocked. There's no sewage system. People are running away from their homes, going somewhere to maybe to refresh themselves.
High hopes that can only be realized if the sale of the diamonds is done transparently.
Greed, conflict, pain and suffering. These are just some of the negative terms associated with the diamond industry. Zimbabwe's diamond fields are controversial, and human rights workers alleged many people have died working there.
This is where some of the diamonds sold so far have come from, Marange in the east of the country. Rights groups allege security forces killed 200 people, raped women and forced children into hard labor.
It's there, and then there are some
atrocities they want the international community to investigate.
Everyone wants diamonds to be sold in this country. It has the potential to change our lives as ordinary citizens, but we want it to be done in a transparent manner. We want it to be done without any human rights abuses taking place. We want it to be done in a manner that does not complicate the gems that are taken out of the ground.
Concerns that seem to have fallen on deaf ears. Zimbabwe's coalition government is celebrating, calling this a new era for the country. Officials vehemently deny security forces are behind alleged widespread atrocities.
You have allegations, which are supported by some of our people who are supposed to know better, that there were human rights issues resulting into more than 200 deaths, and they cannot show one grave. We have said that should be reported to the police. It cannot be collaborated by any villagers in the area, but that becomes an excuse for punishing the country.
Zimbabwe still needs approval to sell its remaining diamond stockpile, close to 4 million carats worth nearly $2 billion. Officials estimate the country could have well over a quarter of the world's diamonds. The poor are waiting to see when some of that money will trickle down to them.
The economic recovery in the world's biggest economy is losing steam. That assessment from the U.S. Federal Reserve roiled stock markets. In a bid to keep alive the recovery, the Fed said it plans to buy more government bonds. It hopes that can keep mortgage costs low and encourage more borrowing and investment. Unemployment is stubbornly high, consumers are spending less, and manufacturing is slowing. So, where is the money coming from? Well, the Fed says it will use the proceeds from the $1.3 trillion of mortgage-linked debt it bought during the 2008 financial crisis. According to economists, the Fed could spend about $20 billion a month buying bonds. Separately, to keep the economy ticking over, U.S. President Barack Obama signed a law approving $26 billion in funding to states struggling just to pay salaries and keep basic services up and running. Well, state and local governments have been making deep cuts, laying off teachers and even turning off streetlights in some areas. Rosalind Jordan reports.
In 2008, there was George Bush's $700 billion Wall Street rescue package, followed by Barack Obama's $787 billion stimulus plan in 2009. But 18 months later, the unemployment rate hovers near 10%. The housing sector is still in trouble. And as a result, state and local governments are now running in the red. According to the National Association of State Budget Officers, tax revenue has fallen in 41 of the 50 U.S. states. That's led to repeated rounds of program cutting, layoffs, and closures. And the stimulus spending, despite its size, wasn't enough to fill the budget gaps. The long-term impact of the recession is that now communities all across the United States are making cuts in areas they once considered essential. For example, in Chicago, with one of the biggest school systems, 400 teachers have been laid off. The city of Colorado Springs is turning off its street lights to cut its power bill. One suburb in Massachusetts is selling its fleet of school buses. And the city of Maynard, California has outsourced all of its services, from police to tax collections. And the pain is expected to grow worse, from the bumpy ride on local roads to the teachers looking for a school to hire them. Wall Street may be back in business, but Main Street is still in the grip of recession.
And remember to check out Counting the Cost online. A whole raft of things available there, which you can get to from the program's link at aljazeera.net/English. We post entire episodes of the show there each week with a blog and special web-only links and content. You can also check out what time we're screening in your neck of the woods each week. And if you're the tweeting type, at AJ Counting the Cost is the name to look for. And that's it for this week. From me, Hazem Sika, and the Counting the Cost team, goodbye.